All right, welcome to Wildlife Cape and Cocktails, episode 20. I'm your host, Yanni Torcola. We've got a very interesting show for you guys tonight. We're talking Mellbloms, spider orchids, and Thynnid wasps. This is a fantastic show for you guys. And in honor of that, we are drinking white orchids. It's 2 measures of vodka, 1 of simple syrup, 1 of lemon juice, 1 of cranberry juice, shaken and over ice. And I've also got some really nice white chocolate mud cake here. Our guest tonight is Dr Noushka Reiter. After completing her Bachelor of Science with honours at the University of Melbourne, she moved on to finish a PhD in 2009 at the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, working with threatened flora. She's currently a research scientist with the Royal Botanic Gardens in Victoria, also part of the Threatened Species Recovery Hub of the National Environmental Science Program. You can check out the gardens on Facebook at Botanic Gardens Victoria or on Twitter at rbg_Victoria. Dr. Noushka, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks, Yanni, for having me on the show.
Excellent. And did you manage to find some dessert and something to drink?
Yeah, currently I've got a little bit of white chocolate here and a coffee rather than cocktails, I'm afraid.
Oh, that's totally suitable. We often go the coffee or tea route ourselves. Awesome. Well, look, we're very happy to have you on. We're very excited to talk orchids and wasps and conservation. But I guess first, I just want to know, how did you actually get interested in orchids? Were you always into plants and gardening? And is it the beauty of their flowers or kind of the cool evolution of their pollination systems that got you into orchids initially?
Yeah, okay. I had a rather interesting childhood, and my parents really liked the great outdoors. So
fantastic.
Yeah, fond childhood memories of being taken out of school on various fall driving trips throughout Australia. And my mum and dad really loved orchids, so I think I inherited a little bit of that from them.
Right. And obviously, when travelling some of those desert roads out through central Queensland and central Australia, we do see some really amazing orchids, even just growing on the side of the road some of the time.
Yeah. Some of our roadsides are quite spectacular.
Yeah, fantastic flowers. I've always been very interested in orchids and all kinds of flowers that have those very complex pollination systems myself. But anyway, very cool. So you got to travel a lot when you were younger. You've seen quite a large amount of Australia then?
I'd like to see a whole lot more.
Wouldn't we all?
Yeah, some of it might have to wait for retirement, but certainly, working with threatened orchids largely across southeastern Australia at the moment, and so I'm really blessed in my job to see some of our fantastic country.
Yeah, excellent. And look, it is interesting that Australian orchids are in a little bit of trouble here. So let's get into that a little bit. So Orchidaceae, it's one of the largest families of flowering plants on the planet, at around 28,000 species. So that's more than mammals, reptiles, and birds combined. It's actually a very ancient group, appearing around 110 million years ago, towards the end of the early Cretaceous period. In fact, around 10% of Australia's plants are orchids. So it's a huge amount of diversity there being so old. And there's about 1,300 species here in Australia, 80% of which are endemic to the country. Now, they're often very beautiful with their flowers and very popular in home gardens. So there's a lot of native orchid societies around the world and in Australia as well. Nonetheless, around 17% of Australian Australian threatened plants are orchids. Is that correct?
Yeah, so just to put things a little bit more in perspective with your stats there. So we actually have something like 297,000 species of plants in Australia.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and orchids only represent, not even 6% of that. But
Okay.
on the threatened flora list, you are right. Disproportionate to their size, there is about 17% of all threatened flora in Australia are orchids. So they're massively overrepresented on the threatened species list, which is a shame.
Yeah, right. And of course, aside from all their aesthetic and intrinsic natural value, why are they so important for wildlife? Is it the complex cross-pollination systems that you get sort of species-dependent pollinators? Like there's certain nectar-producing orchids and things like that?
Look, I don't think their intrinsic value should be put aside. I mean, everyone, since Darwin has been fascinated by orchids, and, David Attenborough came out here to Australia specifically, to film them. They're some of our most fantastic and fascinating plants that, we have to look at. You've got crazy things like orchids that look like ducks that are pollinated by wasps. I think that sort of intrinsic value and the fact that they're threatened, it'd be such a shame to have sort of the next generation that wasn't able to see that. I know myself, when you sort of look through, books on the dodo or whatever, you feel a sense of sadness when you're reading about something that would otherwise be around if it wasn't for us. Yeah.
Absolutely, and I by no means mean to diminish their natural, intrinsic value or anything. They are, phenomenal, and it is an absolute tragedy whenever we do lose a species of any sort, particularly something as beautiful as some of these plants.
Yeah, and look, for biodiversity, I mean, with a couple of hundred species of orchid just in Australia alone that are threatened. It would be sort of quite a loss to our biodiversity to lose those over the next 50 to 100 years. Because most of the species that we're dealing with, there's only a couple that are naturally rarely restricted, and the rest, the reasons why they're restricted is because of us. Land clearance, introduced weeds, rabbits, ancient overcollection, loss of pollinators. There's a large variety of threats that are facing the orchids.
And a lot of them are man-made, so obviously whenever that's the case, it is kind of on us to try to mitigate some of the damage that we're doing to this planet, I suppose.
Yeah, I'd like to think that we would step up to the plate on that front.
Yeah. Well, look, just as a personal interest point, I've always been interested in plants with sort of very direct pollination systems that are very species specific. That kind of what they kind of call magic bullet pollination. So as you've got some plants which kind of just broadcast their pollen out into the air and give everybody hay fever, but you've got other ones that use certain specific methods to attract some kind of animal vector, which then flies off and pollinates the exact same plant. So they have to be kind of really specific in the animals they attract, and then over time those relationships become more specific as the plant evolves to to better attract that animal, which will cause more successful cross-pollinations for it. And it ends up with things like figs and hammer orchids, which slam their little insects pollination visitors onto a little pollen thing and then send it off to go get slammed into another flower, and it's all just really bizarre and awesome, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, orchids have taken that to sort of new and interesting heights. You have, orchids that, provide food rewards, sure, but you have some that, are deceptive and they trick the pollinators into thinking that there's, food rewards, but there aren't any there. And then you've got others that, pretend they're a brood site for a little gnat. And the females come and try and, lay their eggs in while doing so, pollinate the orchid. And you've got other crazy ones, in Caladinia hastata, which is one of the ones that we've recently been working with, where they're sexually deceptive. So they're pretty crazy. So sexually deceptive orchids release pheromones that are essentially imitating the smell of the pollinator's mate. And in the case of, really, really quite specific. And in the case of Caladinia hastata, there's a little Thynnid wasp, Lystrica thynnid, which smells this pheromone, which it thinks it's its mate, and it comes along and mates with the orchid, which is a little bit unfortunate. And in doing so, removes the pollinia, and then it gets duped again, and that's how pollination happens in this orchid. So you can imagine with such specific relationships, if something happens to the pollinator, there's not a lot of future for these plants.
Yeah, right. Well, and that is just one of those really fantastic examples of like what they release some kind of strange semiochemicals, which the males specifically think are the female, and you couldn't get a more accurate magic bullet for pollination from going from one plant to another. Like, it's just a fantastic sort of association and like evolutionary pathway that those two things have convergently taken.
Yeah, and it's been repeated over and over again in Australian orchids. Everything from our cute little green hoods, pterostylis, to in Caladinia, and the hammer orchids, the Drachea that you mentioned before, and our duck orchids. It's repeated again and again throughout the Australian orchid.
Can you tell me a bit more about the duck orchid? That sounds very strange and fascinating to me.
So affectionately called the duck orchid. So they refer to a group of orchids that, look essentially like ducks. We have one here in Victoria called the flying duck orchid, which is endemic to the Grampians, but it also occurs in Western Australia. And then we have, common duck orchids, the large duck orchid Calliana major, which occurs throughout Australia. And then there's a bunch of really sort of limited distribution ones across in Western Australia. But they're quite interesting. And again, it's, an orchid that to us looks like a duck. So you've kind of got the whole beak and sort of body going on just like a duck floating on water. But it hinges on a little trigger. So when the wasp comes in and essentially mates with the duck's head, it gets catapulted in and gets the pollinia deposited on it.
So it's a little duck-faced catapulting insect trap for pollination purposes.
They're very cute.
That's fantastic. Well, look, you did also mention the Caladinia hastata, Mellblom's spider orchid. We did want to talk about that a little bit, actually. So I hear they were once common in Victoria and South Australia, but extinct in South Australia by 2015, with only around, 400 plants left in the wild?
Yeah. They've undergone a sort of a significant range retraction, I would say, largely over the last 100 years. And a lot of that has been habitat clearance, and then habitat sort of degradation after that as well. So
okay,
they're quite limited now. They're only sort of found now in 5 wild sites, and 3 of those sites don't have more than 2 plants. So
wow, 2 orchids per site.
It's in a bad way. And then one of the wild sites we actually discovered during the course of the study that the pollinator appeared to be no longer present. We are hoping it comes back, but through significant habitat degradation that happened across that site, the pollinator wasn't detected over a couple of years of surveys.
Yeah, wow. I mean, that's kind of tragic to see, like to watch how dependent they are on that kind of local pollinator, and that could have also happened in Victoria. I understand, except for some of the work that you were doing along with the Royal Botanical Gardens as their research scientist leading the orchid conservation program down there. Is that correct?
Yeah, we work on about sort of, anywhere between about 20, well, probably about 20 different species each year of sort of federally threatened orchids across southeastern Australia. And so working with the Mellbloms spider orchid has been a bit of a long-term project for us, along with, various partners. So there's a whole group of people involved in sort of conserving this orchid for the long term. So we've been involved with community groups like the Australasian Native Orchid Society, the Australian Network for Plant Conservation, the local Department of Environment, Parks Victoria. We received funding through Portland Aluminium as well as a community exercise, which was great. And the Australian Orchid Foundation. So there's a large group of people that are part of this, which is fantastic. And there were surveys done between 2008 and 2014 to look for potential sites where we could reintroduce the orchid. So I guess the long-term aim being to have more populations back out there that are sustainable. But in order to do that, we had to find sites where the pollinator was present, the vegetation was right, the land was protected, sort of working our way through the different threats that the orchid faced. And it turned out to be quite the long-term project. So we ended up having to survey something like 233 sites.
Wow.
In order to find 5 sites where the pollinator was present. And then of those, only 2 matched the vegetation that we were after. So...
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So, I guess my next question is, how do you survey for the appropriate habitat? You're looking for Thynnid wasps, I understand, which are the main pollinator, the Thynidae family, also known as the flower wasps.
So the genus that we're working with, so we're working with Thynnid wasps, and the genus that we're working with here is Lystricothinus. So Lystricothinus hastata.
Lystricothinus. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
Lystricothinus hastata, as in so closely related to Calodenia hastata that it has the same species name.
Yeah, absolutely. So the wasp was described, obviously relating to the orchid that it pollinates.
Yeah, phenomenal. And are they also beetle larvae parasitoids the way a lot of the Thynidae are? Or? Yeah,
they are. And very little is known about what happens underground. So with these guys, the female is flightless, and at a certain time of year, she comes out from underground and sort of, crawls up a bit of vegetation and waves her bottom around in the wind, and in doing so emits pheromones. And
right.
The guy comes along.
As we all do.
Yeah. The guy comes along, the male wasp, and picks her up and takes her, mates with her, and then takes her off for a bit of feed of nectar, and then often dumps her mid-flight back on the ground. And
that's awful.
Off she goes back underground, and she sort of lays her eggs, from what we believe, on the larvae of scarab beetles. And yeah.
Oh, wow.
So and on it goes. But yeah, I mean, that underground, what happens underground is largely not studied.
Okay. So the males are then lured by Calodenia hastata, the spider orchid pheromones that it releases out of the flower, which basically mimic that of the female wasp, and the pollen is picked up as they try to mate with it and transferred to the next flower that they try to mate with.
Yeah, and so in order to, we call it baiting, and it's what we do at the Botanic Gardens is we actually grow these orchids up from seed with their little mycorrhizal fungi that they like to grow with. And we grow them up into flowering size, and we then use those as bait plants for the surveys, and later on for reintroduction as well. But essentially by taking these plants around when they're flowering, because the attraction to the pheromone is so strong, you will get a response if the wasp is present in the environment within a few minutes.
Okay. So is that how the 2014 surveys were carried out?
So the surveys were carried out between 2008 and 2014, so across that time span, so across very many years.
6 years.
Yeah. So that's how they were carried out. And the trick is as well is that the wasp only flies at higher temperatures. And during a particular, you had to, obviously survey during a particular time of year when the plants were flowering as well. So the window to survey is quite small, particularly in some parts of Victoria where it's quite cold. And if you're down on the coast, you might, only get a handful of days a year where it's warm enough to be baiting for these wasps.
Right, so you've got like a very short window where the flowers and the insects, I guess, are mating in the wild. So you've got to take advantage of it.
Yeah, you do.
All right, wow. And so how did the survey actually work? You're taking an orchid out with you. Are you just waiting for insects to land on it and then capturing them?
Yeah, capturing them and then identifying them. When you're doing these kind of studies, you're looking to make sure that the insect, does its job. So it removes linear so that we can confirm it was a pollinator. So we had to confirm that, the insect was a pollinator and then have a look at, how far it was, distributed in the landscape. And as it turned out, it was incredibly patchy, which really limited the places that we could then reintroduce the plants back into the wild.
Yeah, right. So look, only 2 remaining areas that would have the Thynnid wasps that you were working with. What was the species name again?
So it's Lystricothinnis hastata.
Lystricothinnis and hastata, of course.
Mm-hmm.
So into those areas working with volunteers from, is it the Australasian Native Orchid Society of Victoria? You guys translocated over around 450 plants to those areas, is that correct?
Yeah, we did. We put them back into 2 sites, which is great. And we've now seen natural pollination and seed set at both of those sites, which we're absolutely thrilled about. So it's
right. That's so awesome.
Yeah, it's good news. It's early days. Orchids are long-lived, and we want to sort of monitor these populations through and make sure that they're self-sustaining. And we're still supplementing plants back into these sites. So we'll be working with them for a while longer.
Yeah, keeping an eye on them and just checking on things from time to time as well, I imagine.
Yeah. So we go in and we monitor them every year and have a look at what they're up to, how many are flowering, who was pollinated, and who's setting seed, keeping a friendly eye on how the populations are going.
Yeah, fantastic. And I wanted to ask as well, where does the soil fungi come into the picture? You mentioned as well that they do like those mycorrhizal fungal associations, which they're effectively, as I understand, a parasite to a mycorrhizal fungal host underground?
Well, technically a symbiont, but it's a little bit of a one-way relationship.
It's a little bit orchid skewered.
Yeah, a little bit orchid skewered. So all of terrestrial orchids worldwide are actually reliant upon mycorrhizal associations in order to germinate in the wild, which does put them a little bit aside from other plants. So if the seed does land in an area where there isn't that fungi, then it simply will not germinate. So in order to grow these, we have to go out and isolate the mycorrhizal fungi and bring it back to the lab and grow it up. and then we sort of introduce the seed and fungi together in the lab and germinate them.
What do you have like running cultures of the fungi, or every season do you just go out to the area where the orchids are and collect spores from there or mycorrhiza from there and grow them up?
Yeah, we do keep cultures, but we also do go collecting in winter. So inside the cells in a particular part of the orchid is where the fungi occur. So we isolate the fungi from those cells. And the idea is obviously to get a little bit of a diversity of the fungi in there as well.
Yeah, right.
Sometimes they have quite specific relationships, but, other species have quite broad fungal relationships. So sometimes you might be dealing with one species of fungi and other times many. And most of these fungi that you're working with, or a large proportion, are actually not described. So it makes life really interesting.
Working with lots of undescribed fungi as well. That's very cool. So look, as you mentioned, some of them need just one fungi. Others can use, or some of them I hear even require multiple fungi. So I guess that all with the codependent pollinators and then the mycorrhizal fungi, there's probably fairly few suitable landscapes to start with for some of these threatened orchids. Is that correct?
Well, we're able to introduce the mycorrhizal fungi with the orchids because we germinate the orchids with the fungi, and that then stays with the orchid, which is quite good.
Right, as the root system and the microbiome grows under the soil, it will expand.
Yeah, and we're still very early days with the fungal distribution studies with many of these species, but all the indications so far is at least the fungal partners appear quite widespread across
that's good
Australia,
news.
which is really good. And so that's sort of less difficult, but still, you don't get these kind of fungi often, in agricultural landscapes or highly disturbed landscapes or ones that have had excess fertilizer put on them. So,
right.
You still...
So I guess some of the main issues are that sort of land clearing and modification for grazing, agriculture, and just development in general overall, I suppose.
Yeah, a lot of which is historic. And I mean, some still goes on today as well. And then it's about sort of reducing the threat. So we have a lot of introduced weeds and animals, as you're aware, in Australia. So there's a lot of overgrazing at some sites by rabbits and such, and introduced weeds like felt grass, for example, in Western Victoria, changes the soil, and they sort of have a lot of effect on our natural landscapes that haven't been cleared or used for agriculture. So there's a whole bunch of threats that you need to essentially get under control to make, I guess, translocations work.
Okay. And are you guys actually implementing a lot of control measures yourselves, or are you more looking for areas where you can transplant to as many as possible that you're growing at the botanical gardens?
So we sort of have a whole bunch of selection criteria based around permanently protected land, either public or privately, and then
awesome.
Really good vegetation matches, and then important things like the pollinator being present, and the size of the land being large enough to eventually sort of sustain a healthy population. Those type of issues, very if possible, sort of low weed and animal issues on those sites. But you can't always get that, and then it's about working with the land managers and the land owners, whether they be Parks Victoria or Trust for Nature or private land owners, about improving those sites before they go back in.
Yeah, right. Okay, no worries. And look, not to play devil's advocate too much, but I guess we were talking about grazing, and there's some pretty large kangaroo populations in some parts of this country as well, which aren't contained by agricultural fencing and things like this. what's the impact of native vegetation grazing on orchids like? Is it do they cause quite a significant impact?
Yeah, in some sites they do. So some translocation sites, we just in order to get the populations established, we actually fence the site, and we put in, double gates at either end, which then allows those sites to be opened up to grazing by native animals, over summer and sort of early autumn when the plants are naturally dormant, which keeps the vegetation down, but means that the negative impact from that kind of grazing while these plants are getting established is minimised.
Okay. And I guess, we've spoken about how aesthetically pleasing these flowers are. There is a lot of people who around the world will illegally collect a lot of plants from some kind of sites, some kinds of protected sites as well. Is there much of that going on in Australia, the collection of ornamental orchids from protected sites?
Historically, yes. That was considered quite a large threat. But I think there's been a lot of public awareness raising, particularly by the Australasian Native Orchid Society and Field Nat societies and sort of across Australia, where people are aware now that, that's not the right thing to do. And so I think there's been a real cultural shift there, and that we're not really seeing that so much over the last couple of decades. But certainly, and that's been helped by legislation, sort of all the federally protected orchids, they're not allowed to be picked in the wild. And, in Victoria, for example, all orchids are protected.
Fantastic.
Which is a great thing, and I think there's more sort of enthusiasm from the community to see them in the wild than to dig them up and have them anywhere else. But certainly there was again sort of on the legislation front as well. There was the International Trade in Endangered Species. Orchids, the whole family was put on there, so it's actually illegal without permits to trade orchids internationally. But there is still quite a lot of it going and on in the world, and there are sort of large areas in the tropics throughout Asia and South America and such as well, where large-scale collection still occurs. And is one of the major threats to those species in the wild.
Yeah, well, so I guess the advice would be to, as we mentioned, there's so many of these native orchid societies that you could go to and learn how to, I suppose, grow a lot of your own ones of the, maybe not all of the threatened species, but still some fantastically beautiful flowers.
Yeah, absolutely. There's threatened orchids. There's native orchid societies all over Australia, and there's probably a group close to anyone that's listening, and many of them have conservation groups that you can become involved in.
Yeah, awesome. And speaking of, I understand you're currently working to introduce reintroduce around 20 threatened orchid species down there in Victoria. Is that what you guys are up to at the moment?
Yeah, so we're working with different partner organisations across sort of New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia. And so we have quite a few of those species that we've propagated now in the lab with their fungi. And we're growing them on in the nursery and actively partaking in a lot of the natural history and ecology studies in the wild. Because many of these species, we don't know what the pollinator is or their mycorrhizal associations are, and some of them, the methods to propagate them aren't established. So, we're doing some of that base natural history and working with different groups in order to eventually get these species back into the wild.
Yeah, well, but obviously, very hard work and a lot of research to do with so many threatened orchid species that Quite a monumental effort that you guys are undertaking down there.
Yeah, look, it's really helped out by enthusiastic volunteers and project partners, and it's been a work of love by a lot of people. And I think without the community group involvement, it simply wouldn't happen. Yeah. So
awesome.
They've been fantastic.
Yeah, excellent. Well, look, we're pretty much at the end of our show here, which is fantastic because you're starting to break up. But thank you so much. Thank you so much. This has been really, really awesome. I hope we can talk to you about orchids at some point, hopefully face to face, sitting down in the future. If you're ever up here in Brisbane, we'd love to have you on the show. That's Dr. Noushka Reiter, everybody.
Thank you. And I'll chat to you again.
Cheers.
Soon.
Cheers. No worries. Now, by the way, before you go, is there any anything else you'd like to plug? I know you guys can check out if you're at home, you can check out the Threatened Species Recovery Hub on Facebook at NESP Threatened Species, or on Twitter at TSR Hub. And again, you can check out the Botanical Gardens of Victoria on Facebook at Botanic Gardens Victoria, or on Twitter at RBG_Victoria. Did I miss anything?
Yeah, so if you go to the RBGV website and if you look under science, there'll be a little link to the Orchid Conservation Program, and you can have a look there about some of the work that we get up to and some of the species that we're working with. So
wonderful.
Check us out. Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. And as always, check out the Threatened Species Recovery Hub. And guys, coming up on March 25th, it's the RepX Brisbane Reptile Expo at the Royal International Convention Centre at the Brisbane Showgrounds. 1,700 metres squared of reptiles and much more for you to come and check out. So that is also coming up. Noushka, thank you again so much for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure. I can't wait to do it again.
Thank you.
Cheers, no worries. Guys, I've been Yanni Torcola. Plenty more wildlife cake and cocktails coming up for you soon. Cheers, we'll see you shortly. Bye.